Eloan Hartwell had always believed that some meetings were written in the quiet margins of fate, the kind that seemed ordinary in the moment but revealed their significance only in hindsight. She was 23, a young woman with an old soul, standing amidst the oak-paneled halls of Oxford on a rainy autumn afternoon. The air was heavy with the scent of damp leaves and old books, students with umbrellas hurried through the cobblestone courtyard, and the echo of their laughter bounced against the ancient stone walls. Eloan, wrapped in her long camel coat, clutched a folder of research notes to her chest as she made her way to the small lecture theatre where a symposium on English literature was being held. She was not expecting anything remarkable that day. Her focus was on her studies, on the papers she had been working tirelessly to refine, and on the quiet satisfaction she felt when immersed in the world of words. But destiny, as it often does, had other plans. Inside the lecture hall, the dim light glowed against polished wooden benches and rows of eager faces. Among them sat Benedict Rowe, a name Eloan did not yet know but one she would never forget. He was seated near the front, leaning slightly over his notebook, his dark hair untidy in a way that looked unintentional but effortlessly striking. There was something commanding in his posture, yet thoughtful in his eyes that seemed to drink in every word the speaker delivered. When Eloan was called upon to present her paper, her voice was steady though her heart raced. She spoke of Shakespeare's women, how they carried strength beneath silence, how they bore the weight of choices made by men yet carved their own legacies in quiet defiance. As she spoke, she noticed him watching her, not with idle curiosity but with a sharp attentiveness that unsettled and intrigued her. His gaze did not make her falter, instead, it lent her a strange confidence, as though he understood her words in a way few ever had. After the session ended, the crowd dispersed into small circles of conversation. Eloan lingered near the lectern, tucking her notes away, when a voice spoke behind her. "You made Ophelia sound less like a victim and more like a mirror," the man said. She turned and found herself face to face with him, Benedict Rowe. Up close, his presence was even more arresting. His voice carried the calm assurance of someone who rarely doubted himself, yet there was warmth in it, too, as if he wanted her to feel at ease. Perhaps she was both, Eloan replied softly, surprised by her own boldness. A victim, yes, but also a reflection of those who failed to see her truth. Benedict smiled, the kind of smile that was not easily forgotten. "That's a perspective worth remembering. May I buy you a coffee? I'd like to hear more about how you see the world." And so it began, not with fireworks or declarations, but with a simple offer over coffee in a small café tucked along a quiet Oxford street. The rain still fell outside, streaking the windows as the two of them leaned across the wooden table, sharing thoughts on books, life, and the strange inevitability of certain encounters. Eloan, who had always felt slightly apart from the world, found herself drawn to Benedict's intensity, his ambition, and the way he seemed to make her ideas feel both weighty and beautiful. For Benedict, there was something magnetic about Eloan's quiet strength. Unlike others who admired him for his charm or intelligence, she looked past the surface and spoke to the parts of him that were restless, searching. He listened to her as though every word mattered. In the space of a single afternoon, an invisible thread began to weave itself between them, fragile, delicate, but undeniable. Neither of them knew, as they stepped back into the rain, that this encounter would alter the course of their lives. What began as a chance meeting over literature would grow into a love so fierce and consuming that it would define their youth, shape their choices, and eventually test the very limits of their hearts. It was, after all, only the beginning. The years after Oxford unfolded like pages of a novel that seemed too perfect to be real. For Eloan Hartwell, life with Benedict Rowe was a season of golden light. They had courted through countless evenings of conversation, midnight walks along the Thames, and letters passed during summers when distance kept them apart. By the time Benedict knelt on one knee beneath the twinkling lights of Covent Garden, it felt less like a surprise and more like the natural conclusion to a story that had been waiting to be written. Their wedding was not lavish, though it carried a kind of understated elegance that mirrored them both. The ceremony was held in a historic chapel on the outskirts of Cambridge, its stone walls draped with ivy, the soft scent of lilies filling the air. Eloan wore a gown of delicate lace, her dark hair gathered in a simple chignon, and when she walked down the aisle, every guest seemed to hold their breath. Benedict, waiting at the altar, looked at her as though nothing else in the world existed. For Eloan, that gaze was enough. In it she saw devotion, ambition, and a promise of partnership. When their vows were exchanged, there were tears in her eyes, though her voice never wavered. "I will walk with you through every season," she said. Benedict's words were equally steady, but beneath them lay a kind of hunger, an eagerness for a life that was not only shared but conquered. The reception was filled with laughter and music. Friends clinked glasses of champagne, and family members embraced with joy. Eloan remembered little of the speeches or the taste of the food. What lingered in her memory was the warmth of Benedict's hand in hers, the quiet certainty that she had found her life's anchor. That night, as they danced beneath strings of golden lights, she whispered to him, "It feels like a dream." "A dream we'll never wake from," Benedict replied, pressing his lips against her forehead. Their early years of marriage were bathed in that dreamlike glow. They settled into a modest flat in London, where mornings smelled of fresh coffee and evenings were spent reading together by lamplight. Eloan pursued her postgraduate studies, while Benedict climbed the ranks of a prestigious law firm. He was tireless, ambitious, and often returned home late, but Eloan admired his drive. She told herself that his long hours were simply sacrifices made for their shared future. She, too, made sacrifices. Eloan's passion for writing often took second place to household responsibilities. She cooked, kept their home, and offered him unwavering support. When he arrived home weary, she greeted him with warmth, never complaining of her own exhaustion. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that love was built upon compromise and devotion. On weekends, they escaped the city. Sometimes it was a cottage in the Cotswolds, where mist rolled over green hills at dawn. Sometimes it was the seaside cliffs of Cornwall, where they walked barefoot on the sand, their laughter carried away by the wind. These moments were snapshots of happiness, reminders of why they had chosen each other. Yet even in the midst of such joy, small shadows crept in unnoticed. Benedict's conversations increasingly revolved around his career, the cases he was winning, the colleagues he needed to impress. He would speak with passion about legal victories but grow distracted when Eloan mentioned her writing or her research. She brushed it aside, convincing herself that it was natural, that marriage required patience and understanding. There were times, late at night, when she lay awake beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and wondered if his dreams still included her. But whenever doubt threatened to take root, Benedict's smile or a sudden gesture of affection would banish it. He still held her hand in crowded rooms, still kissed her forehead when she worried, still called her "my Eloan" in moments of tenderness. And for her, those fragments of intimacy were enough to silence the questions that whispered in the back of her mind. To their friends and family, they were the perfect couple, young, accomplished, deeply in love. To Eloan, they were simply two souls who had found each other and vowed to walk side by side. She believed their story was unshakable, carved in stone, destined to endure. But the truth, as time would reveal, was that even the most beautiful dreams have cracks hidden beneath their glow. The rhythm of married life soon settled into a pattern, predictable on the surface, yet full of unseen compromises that fell mostly upon Eloan's shoulders. Their London flat, once filled with the fresh energy of newlyweds, slowly transformed into a space of quiet routines. Each morning, Benedict rose early, his suit pressed, his tie meticulously knotted. He would kiss Eloan quickly, coffee in hand, before disappearing into the rush of the city. By evening, his return was less certain. Sometimes he arrived home well past midnight, too exhausted even to eat, falling asleep on the sofa with legal documents scattered across the table. Eloan adapted. She told herself this was what marriage required: patience, resilience, and the ability to hold everything together while her husband chased ambitions that would one day benefit them both. She balanced her postgraduate work with managing the household. She learned how to fix leaky taps, how to pay bills on time, how to keep their little world functioning smoothly. When Benedict was absent, she filled the silence with books, journal entries, and the half-finished stories she wrote but rarely shared. Her own dreams of becoming a published author quietly drifted into the background. She had started her first manuscript at Oxford, a collection of short stories inspired by the women of Shakespeare who had once fueled her passion. But as days blurred into weeks and weeks into months, she found less time, and less energy, to devote to it. The manuscript sat untouched in a drawer, a symbol of the life she might have lived if love had not redirected her path. To everyone else, Eloane seemed content. She hosted dinners for Benedict's colleagues, listening attentively as they discussed cases she barely understood. She smiled graciously when praised for her charm and intellect, though few noticed how little she spoke. She wore dresses Benedict admired, played the part of the supportive wife, and made certain their home radiated warmth even when she herself felt cold inside. Benedict did love her, in his own way. There were moments when his affection broke through the fog of work, an unexpected bouquet of lilies on her desk, a weekend trip to Edinburgh where they strolled hand in hand through cobblestone streets, his voice soft when he called her, "my anchor." Yet those gestures were fleeting, often overshadowed by his relentless pursuit of success. Eloane never complained. She believed silence was the purest form of devotion, that love meant bearing weight without expecting acknowledgement. But in the quiet hours of night, when the city hummed outside their window and Benedict slept soundly beside her, she felt the ache of unspoken sacrifices. She wondered whether he noticed how much of herself she had set aside to ensure his path remained clear. Her friends from Oxford often asked when she would return to her writing. "You had such a gift, Eloane," they said. She would smile, offer vague replies about being too busy, and change the subject. Deep down, she feared that the longer she waited, the dimmer her voice as a writer would become. Still, she clung to hope. She told herself this was only temporary, that once Benedict achieved stability in his career, there would be time for her dreams too. She envisioned a future where they would sit together in a quiet study, he reviewing cases while she finished her stories, both of them thriving side by side. That image kept her going, even when reality felt starkly different. But cracks had already begun to form in their marriage, hairline fractures invisible to the outside world but sharp enough to sting her heart. Benedict's ambition, though admirable, often left no room for her. His conversations at dinner grew shorter, his eyes frequently drifting to his phone. When she spoke of her day, he nodded politely but rarely asked for more. Eloane reminded herself that he was simply tired, that his silence was not neglect but exhaustion. Yet the feeling of being unseen, unheard, grew heavier with each passing night. In the stillness of those evenings, Eloane began to sense a loneliness more profound than any she had known before. She was married, yet solitary. She was loved, yet overlooked. And though she told herself she could endure it, a part of her heart whispered that no amount of silent sacrifice could hold a marriage together if love was no longer nurtured. Unaware, Benedict pressed onward, blinded by ambition. And Eloane, ever faithful, bore the weight quietly, never suspecting that these sacrifices, once made in the name of love, would one day be the very chains that bound her to heartbreak. The weeks following the fateful night at the pub unfolded like a slow bleed. Cecilia moved about the cottage with the mechanical precision of someone determined not to feel too much. She woke, she worked, she cooked, she smiled politely when neighbors passed by, but inside, she was hollowing out. The words she longed to scream, "Why her? Why us?" never left her lips. Instead, she wrapped them tightly around her chest, burying them deep like family secrets no one dared to unearth. Lionel, for his part, carried himself as though nothing had shifted between them. He spoke to her in the same calm tones, asked about her day, left little notes on the kitchen counter reminding her to buy milk or to feed the cat. But his eyes, those once trusted eyes, gave him away. They darted too quickly when hers met his. They lingered too long on his phone, glowing late at night. He never mentioned Eleanor again, but silence can be a more damning confession than words. Cecilia found herself studying him the way a detective might study a suspect, searching for cracks in his alibi. Every pause before he answered, every careless smile, every late return home became another line in a growing ledger of suspicions. Yet when friends asked if she was all right, she replied with cheerful lies, "We're doing well, thank you. Just busy with work." She feared the humiliation of being pitted more than the loneliness that gnawed at her. At night, the bed became a battlefield. They lay side by side, but miles of emotional distance stretched between them. His back often turned toward her, she would stare into the dark, rehearsing conversations she never had the courage to begin. Words like betrayal and divorce pulsed at the edges of her thoughts, but still she clung to the fading hope that perhaps this storm might pass without wrecking everything they had built. Yet the silence was corrosive. It seeped into her routines, staining them with melancholy. When she painted in her small studio, colors dulled beneath her brush. When she read, the words blurred, her mind circling back to the unanswered questions. Even music betrayed her, songs that once uplifted her now sounded like cruel reminders of what she had lost. One evening, after a particularly strained dinner, Lionel reached across the table, resting his hand on hers. For a fleeting moment, Cecilia felt the warmth of the man she once adored, the man who had proposed under the lilac trees of Cambridge and vowed to spend his life making her laugh. But as quickly as the warmth came, so did the icy memory of him holding Eleanor's hand in that dimly lit pub. She withdrew her hand gently, pretending she needed to refill her glass of water. Lionel didn't protest, but the flicker of hurt in his eyes was undeniable. The next morning, Cecilia caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. There were new lines at the corners of her mouth, carved by nights of clenched silence. Her once bright gaze seemed clouded with questions she couldn't voice. For the first time, she admitted to herself that this was no passing shadow, it was a fracture that, left unattended, might never heal. But what unsettled her most was not Lionel's betrayal, nor even Eleanor's intrusion into their lives. It was her own complicity in the silence. Each day she chose not to speak, she became a little more of a stranger to herself. The realization struck her like a chill wind, by protecting him from confrontation, she was abandoning herself. That night, as Lionel slept soundly beside her, Cecilia lay awake with her heart pounding. She resolved that the silence must end soon. Words would have to be spoken, no matter how sharp their edges. She didn't yet know whether they would lead to repair or to ruin, but she knew she could no longer live in the hollow space between. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of clarity. Change was coming. And whether it brought freedom or devastation, she would face it with eyes wide open. The following Saturday, the town of Windermere buzzed with its annual spring fair. Normally, Cecilia loved the event, the music, the scent of roasted chestnuts, the laughter of children chasing balloons down the cobblestone streets. It was a celebration of community, of simple joy, and she had always found comfort in its familiarity. This year, however, the fair felt like an elaborate performance staged for everyone but her. She and Lionel arrived hand in hand, as though nothing were amiss. Neighbors waved warmly, and acquaintances greeted them as such a lovely couple. Cecilia smiled dutifully, her lips curving without conviction, while inside she felt like a glass vessel about to shatter. The irony was unbearable. In public, they were a picture of harmony, but in private, their foundation trembled beneath the weight of unspoken truths. Eleanor was there, too. Cecilia spotted her near the flower stalls, her copper hair catching the afternoon sun. The sight of her was like a needle to Cecilia's chest, sharp, unavoidable. Eleanor glanced up, meeting her gaze briefly, before looking away with a studied nonchalance. Lionel stiffened beside her. That tiny, almost imperceptible shift of his body told Cecilia everything she needed to know. The wound was still fresh, the story far from over. As the day wore on, Cecilia found herself playing two roles at once, the dutiful wife smiling at Lionel's side, and the wounded observer cataloguing every sign of his discomfort. When his laugh rang too loudly, when his arm lingered protectively around her waist, when his compliments felt rehearsed, she recognized them for what they were, not gestures of love, but shields of denial. The facade finally cracked during the evening dance. Strings of lanterns glowed overhead as couples twirled across the square. Lionel invited Cecilia to join him, and though her heart was heavy, she accepted. For a few moments, they moved gracefully, their bodies swaying to the rhythm of the violins. Yet Cecilia felt none of the intimacy she once treasured. Instead, the dance seemed like a parody of their marriage, elegant on the surface, empty beneath. And then it happened. Across the square, Eleanor laughed at something a friend had said, the sound carrying easily in the night air. Lionel faltered. His step missed the beat, his grip on Cecilia's hand tightening just slightly. It was subtle, something no one else might have noticed, but Cecilia did. The world seemed to still around her. In that split second, she realized the truth she had been avoiding. Lionel's heart was not entirely hers anymore, and perhaps never would be again. When the music ended, Cecilia excused herself under the pretense of needing fresh air. She slipped away from the lantern-lit crowd and found herself near the edge of the lake. The water reflected the shimmering lights of the fair, rippling gently with the breeze. She inhaled deeply, desperate to steady the storm within her. Alone with the quiet lapping of the waves, Cecilia allowed her mask to fall. Tears slid down her cheeks, hot against the cool evening air. She wept not only for Lionel's betrayal, but for the version of herself who had believed love alone could keep them whole. That innocence, she knew, was gone. Cecilia? The voice startled her. She turned to see Matthew, Lionel's oldest friend, the one who had known them since their university days. His expression softened when he noticed her tears. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said gently. "But, you looked as though you could use a friend." Cecilia hesitated, embarrassed to be seen in such a fragile state. Yet something in Matthew's eyes, an honesty untainted by pretense, made her nod. He stepped closer, offering a handkerchief. She accepted it, pressing it to her face as she tried to compose herself. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her. Matthew shook his head softly. "No, you're not. And that's all right." His words, simple as they were, pierced through her defenses. For the first time in weeks, Cecilia felt seen, not as part of a flawless couple, not as a woman maintaining appearances, but as herself, raw and wounded. She didn't unburden everything, not yet. But in Matthew's presence, she sensed the possibility of something she had nearly forgotten, kindness without conditions. As the fair continued in the distance, Cecilia realized that her silence would not last much longer. The cracks in her facade were widening, and soon the truth, her truth, would demand to be spoken. The morning after the fair dawned gray, as though the skies themselves carried the weight of what was to come. Cecilia stood at the kitchen window, watching raindrops trickle down the glass. Behind her, the kettle whistled, but she made no move to silence it. The shrill sound seemed almost fitting, a warning cry for the storm she could no longer keep at bay. Lionel shuffled into the room, hair tousled, the weariness of late nights etched into the lines of his face. He greeted her casually, as though nothing had happened, as though last night hadn't cracked the careful mask they had both been wearing. "Tea?" he asked, reaching for a mug. "Sit down, Lionel," Cecilia said. Her voice was steady, almost unnervingly calm. He froze, the mug halfway to his hand, and turned slowly. Something in her tone told him this wasn't an ordinary morning. With a wary nod, he sat at the table, folding his hands in front of him like a schoolboy awaiting reprimand. For a long moment, silence hung between them. The only sounds were the rain pattering against the window and the kettle's fading hiss. Cecilia finally turned to face him, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "I saw you," she said. Lionel frowned. "Saw me what?" "At the fair. The way you looked at Eleanor. The way you faltered when she laughed. I've seen it before, Lionel, in the pub weeks ago. Do you think I'm blind?" His face drained of color. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, struggling to summon words. At last, he muttered, "It's not what you think." Cecilia leaned forward, her voice trembling not with weakness, but with restrained fury. "Then tell me what it is. Because from where I stand, my husband is either in love with someone else, or playing a cruel game he doesn't even have the courage to admit." Lionel's composure cracked. He buried his face in his hands, groaning softly. "It was a mistake, Cecilia. A foolish, reckless mistake. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" Her laugh was bitter, sharp as broken glass. "You don't look at someone that way if it means nothing." You don't risk our marriage, for nothing. He lifted his head, eyes glassy with guilt. I never stopped loving you. You must believe that. Love, she spat. Love doesn't humiliate. Love doesn't make me question my worth every night in my own bed. If you loved me as you claim, you wouldn't have reached for her hand in that pub, you wouldn't still be aching when she's near. Do you think I can't feel it? That I don't notice when you drift away even as you sit beside me? Lionel's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. For once, he didn't try to defend himself. He simply sat there, staring at the table as though the grain of the wood might offer an escape. Cecilia's anger simmered into something heavier, something more painful. You've stolen something from me, she whispered. Not just trust, though God knows that's gone, but the certainty that we were on the same side. Do you understand how lonely it is to share a life with someone who is only half present? The silence that followed was suffocating. Lionel's lips moved as though he might apologize again, but Cecilia raised her hand sharply. Don't, she said. Don't cheapen this with words unless they carry truth. You had your chance to choose us. And you chose her, even if only for a moment, even if you tell yourself it was meaningless. That choice echoes, Lionel. And I will not carry it for you. For the first time in their marriage, Lionel looked utterly defeated. His eyes, once a source of comfort, now reflected only regret. What do you want me to do? He asked hoarsely. Cecilia drew in a deep breath. The rain outside beat harder against the glass, mirroring the storm inside her. I want honesty. Brutal, unflinching honesty. Not excuses, not evasions. If you want to fight for this marriage, then say so and prove it. If your heart belongs to her, then say that too, and set me free. But don't keep me prisoner in this limbo. I deserve better. Her words hung between them like a verdict. Lionel didn't answer immediately. His silence, once a shield, now felt like the very thing that might destroy them. Cecilia rose from her chair, her decision firm. I'll give you time to decide, Lionel. But know this, whatever choice you make, I will no longer sacrifice myself to silence. Not for you. Not for anyone. With that, she left the room, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hall. Lionel remained at the table, staring at the mug he had never filled, the rain still tapping its relentless rhythm against the windowpane. For the first time, the facade of their marriage had shattered completely. And both of them knew nothing would ever be the same again. Lionel spent the next days in a haze, moving through the cottage as though he were a ghost inhabiting his own life. Cecilia's words from that morning still rang in his ears, I will no longer sacrifice myself to silence. They had struck him with the force of a verdict, and he could not escape the truth of them. At the office, he found himself distracted, staring blankly at paperwork until his secretary gently reminded him of meetings. Colleagues noticed his absent mind, though none dared to comment. At home, he moved carefully, as though every step might set off a hidden trap. Cecilia had not withdrawn completely, she still shared meals with him, still tended to small courtesies. But there was a new distance in her eyes, a steeliness that unnerved him. Late at night, Lionel sat alone in the study, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. He replayed the moments with Eleanor, her laughter, her warmth, the thrill of being wanted again. Yet alongside those memories came the image of Cecilia's tear-stained face, her trembling voice demanding honesty. He felt torn between two worlds, one that fed his ego and another that demanded his soul. Eleanor had sent him a single message after the fair, "Are you all right?" He had stared at it for an hour before deleting it without reply. He knew that road led only to ruin. And yet the thought of her lingered, a temptation not of love but of escape, from his own inadequacies, from the weight of years in a marriage he had taken for granted. Meanwhile, Cecilia carried herself with quiet resolve. She painted again, though her strokes were darker, bolder than before. She met friends for coffee, her laughter returning in measured doses. And once, when Lionel entered the room unexpectedly, he found her speaking softly with Matthew in the garden. Their heads bent close, not in romance but in an intimacy forged of trust. Lionel's stomach tightened at the sight, though he said nothing. The irony was not lost on him. He, the betrayer, now felt the sting of being on the outside. The tension finally broke one evening when Cecilia returned home late. She placed her keys on the table and found Lionel waiting in the sitting room, his expression weary, almost desperate. "We need to talk," he said. Cecilia studied him carefully, noting the slump of his shoulders, the way his hand twitched against the arm of the chair. She set her bag down and sat opposite him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I've thought about what you said," Lionel began. His voice was hoarse, his usual calm replaced by something raw. "And you're right. I've been a coward. I've hidden behind silence because I was too afraid to face what I'd done." Cecilia's gaze remained steady. "And what have you decided?" Lionel inhaled sharply, as though bracing himself. "I want to fight for us. Not out of duty, not out of fear of scandal, but because I cannot imagine life without you. I was foolish, selfish, and weak. But I love you, Cecilia. That hasn't changed." Her heart ached at his words, yet she did not let herself be swayed so easily. "Love isn't enough, Lionel. Not anymore. Love is action, it is truth. And you have given me neither." "I will," he pleaded. "If you let me, I'll prove it. I'll cut all ties with Eleanor. I'll do whatever it takes." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Cecilia's chest rose and fell as she weighed his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the man she had chosen years ago still existed beneath the cracks. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger in recent weeks, whispered caution. "Promises are easy," she said softly. "Trust is not. And you can't rebuild it overnight." Lionel's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Then let me start now. Please." Cecilia studied him for a long time, then stood. "This is not my decision alone, Lionel. It's yours. You must choose every day whether to honor us or betray us. And until I see that choice in your actions, your words mean nothing." With that, she left him in the sitting room, her footsteps fading upstairs. Lionel remained where he was, staring at the fire until it burned down to embers. For the first time, he understood that redemption was not his to declare, it was hers to grant, if she ever chose to. And that truth weighed heavier than any guilt he had known. The days that followed unfolded like a quiet revolution inside Cecilia's heart. She no longer woke each morning with the singular thought of Lionel's betrayal pressing down on her. Instead, she began to notice small, unexpected freedoms in the space created by her distance from him. She poured her energy into her art, spending long hours in the studio at the back of the cottage. The canvases that once carried muted tones now bloomed with bold strokes of crimson and indigo, colors that demanded to be seen. Neighbors who dropped by to purchase her work remarked on the intensity of her new style. Cecilia only smiled, never explaining that the fierceness on the canvas was the language of her survival. Matthew's presence in her life grew quietly, without force or presumption. He checked in with small gestures, dropping off a basket of fresh apples from his orchard, recommending a new book he thought she might enjoy, inviting her to walk with him along the lakeside trails. Their conversations were never about Lionel, nor Eleanor, nor even betrayal. Instead, they spoke of art, of history, of the small beauties of life often overlooked. For Cecilia, these moments were like sips of clear water after wandering in a desert. With Matthew, she could simply exist, unburdened by the weight of performance. He never sought to rescue her, nor did he push her toward confessions she wasn't ready to make. He was simply there, a quiet, steady presence that reminded her she was more than just a wounded wife. Lionel noticed the change. He noticed everything. The way Cecilia hummed again while preparing tea, the way she returned from her walks with Matthew with a softness in her eyes he hadn't seen in months. He told himself he wasn't jealous, but the truth gnawed at him. He was a man who had squandered her trust, and now he was forced to watch another man provide her the comfort he no longer could. Determined to prove his sincerity, Lionel threw himself into small acts of atonement. He cancelled late nights at the office, prepared meals, fixed the leaky roof Cecilia had complained about for years. He spoke with earnestness, shared memories of their early years, and once even placed a bouquet of wildflowers on her easel. But Cecilia met these gestures with measured reserve. She appreciated them, yes, but they no longer swept her away. She had grown cautious, her heart no longer a door flung open at the first knock. One evening, while walking along the lake with Matthew, Cecilia confessed something she had not even admitted to herself. "I used to believe," she said quietly, "that love was about sacrifice. About bending yourself to keep the other person whole. I thought that was noble. But now, I think it was cowardice. I was too afraid to face the truth, too afraid of being alone. I let silence devour me." Matthew listened without interrupting, his hands folded loosely behind his back. When she finished, he nodded. "It takes courage to see yourself clearly. And greater courage still to change what you see." His words lingered in her long after the walk had ended. That night, lying in bed beside Lionel, Cecilia realized she no longer feared solitude. The thought of being on her own, once terrifying, now carried with it a strange sense of possibility. Lionel stirred beside her, murmuring her name in his sleep. She watched him for a moment, remembering the man who had once been her safe harbor. Perhaps he could be that man again, but she no longer depended on it. Her life, her happiness, could no longer be tethered solely to his choices. The next morning, she stood before her mirror, adjusting a scarf around her neck. For the first time in months, she smiled at her reflection. It wasn't the smile of a woman pretending for the world. It was the smile of someone who had rediscovered a piece of herself. When she stepped into the garden, Matthew was waiting by the gate with a book in hand. He raised it slightly in greeting, his expression gentle. Lionel, watching from the window, felt a pang of fear, not just of losing her, but of realizing she might not need him at all. Cecilia didn't yet know where the path would lead, whether back into Lionel's arms, into a new beginning with Matthew, or into a life entirely her own. But for the first time, she was no longer afraid of the choice. She had found her strength. And whatever lay ahead, it would be on her terms. The decision came to Cecilia one morning as she stood in her studio, gazing at the canvases that crowded the walls. Dozens of them, some finished, some still raw with wet paint, each a fragment of her journey through silence, betrayal, and the stirring of new strength. She realized that hiding them away, as she had hidden her pain, no longer suited her. When she received an invitation to display her work at a small gallery in Kendal, she accepted without hesitation. The thought frightened her, exposing her art meant exposing herself, but the fear was different now. It was not the paralyzing fear of humiliation or abandonment. It was the kind of fear that accompanied growth, the kind that whispered, "This matters." As the date approached, Cecilia threw herself into preparation. She selected her boldest pieces, those filled with deep crimson swirls and jagged streaks of blue, canvases that bore the raw truth of her heartbreak. Each stroke carried memory, the night of the pub, the silence of their home, the storm in her chest, and the fragile thread of hope she had begun to weave for herself. Lionel watched the transformation with unease. He admired her dedication, yet it unsettled him to see her so alive, so radiant, in a world that did not include him. One evening, while she carefully wrapped a painting in brown paper, he asked quietly, "Do you want me there? At the exhibition?" Cecilia paused, considering. She looked at him, not cruelly, but with clarity. "You may come if you like," she said at last. "But understand this, it's not about us. It's about me." The gallery opening was a crisp April evening, the air scented with blooming daffodils from the square outside. Inside, the walls glowed with light, each of Cecilia's canvases demanding the attention of the crowd that had gathered. People wandered from piece to piece, murmuring their admiration. Strangers she had never met stood before her work and saw something of themselves in it. The vulnerability of sharing her pain transformed into connection, and in that moment, Cecilia felt freer than she had in years. Matthew was there, of course. He greeted her with quiet pride, offering no grand declarations, only a steady smile that warmed her more than any flattery could. He lingered near the edges of the crowd, making sure she had the spotlight she deserved. Lionel arrived later, his expression tight, his suit a little too carefully chosen. He moved among the guests awkwardly, accepting their compliments on his wife's talent with a strained smile. When he stopped before one of her most striking works, a storm of black and red that she had titled Fracture, he stared for a long time. He seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that the canvas was not merely paint, but a mirror of the damage he had caused. At the end of the evening, the gallery owner approached Cecilia with glowing words. Several pieces had already sold, and there was interest in commissioning more. Cecilia listened, her heart swelling, not just with pride, but with relief. She had given her pain purpose. When the last of the guests had gone, Lionel approached her. "Cecilia," he said softly, "I didn't realize how much of yourself you've carried alone. Your art, it's extraordinary. And devastating." Cecilia met his gaze, her own steady and calm. "It's the truth," she replied. "The truth I could never speak aloud." For a moment, Lionel seemed about to reach for her hand, but he stopped himself. He understood now that whatever he once took for granted could no longer be demanded. As they stepped outside into the cool night, Matthew caught her eye from across the square. He didn't approach, only lifted a hand in a quiet gesture of farewell. Cecilia returned the gesture, her lips curving in a private smile. Lionel noticed, of course. And though jealousy flared within him, it was tempered by something deeper, fear. Not of Matthew, but of the possibility that Cecilia no longer needed him at all. For the first time, Lionel grasped the reality that saving their marriage would require more than apologies and gestures. He would have to face himself, the man who had betrayed, the man who had faltered, and decide whether he could truly become someone worthy of her again. Cecilia, meanwhile, felt lighter as she walked into the night air. The exhibition had not solved her questions, nor erased her pain, but it had given her something Lionel never could, a sense of her own strength, independent and unshakable. And that, she knew, was only the beginning. The weeks that followed Eleanor's first meeting with Adrian were like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in what felt like years, she felt her heart opening again. Their connection was built not on appearances, not on obligation, but on shared values and genuine respect. Adrian admired her resilience, her intellect, and the dignity with which she carried herself despite the storms she had endured. He treated her as an equal, never diminishing her voice, and it was this consistency that began to heal wounds Matthew had left behind. One Saturday evening, Adrian invited her to a charity gala hosted at an elegant hotel in London. Eleanor hesitated at first, public events still made her wary, as if people were silently judging her past, but Adrian reassured her with a simple promise: "Walk in with me, and you'll never stand alone." Dressed in a sleek navy gown, Eleanor entered the grand ballroom beside Adrian. The chandeliers glittered above, orchestral music floated through the air, and guests mingled in clusters, glasses of champagne in hand. Adrian introduced her proudly to his colleagues, never once treating her as an accessory but as someone he admired deeply. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt seen, not as Matthew's ex-wife, not as a scandalous figure whispered about in corners, but as herself, Eleanor Ashford, a woman of strength and quiet elegance. The evening was nearly perfect until a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "Eleanor?" She froze. The sound of that voice was like a shard of glass slicing through silk. Turning slowly, she saw him, Matthew. He looked older, though only a year had passed. His eyes carried a desperate edge, his smile strained. Eleanor's pulse quickened, not with longing, but with a strange mixture of dread and pity. Matthew stepped closer, ignoring Adrian at her side. "I can't believe it's really you. I've been meaning to reach out. You look radiant." Eleanor kept her composure. "Matthew." Her tone was even, cool. "What are you doing here?" He spread his hands. "Networking, business, but fate seems to have brought us together. Eleanor, I've made mistakes, terrible ones. I was blind, chasing something that meant nothing. Clara left me, and I realized too late what I'd thrown away. Adrian shifted subtly, his presence steady beside her. Matthew noticed him then, and his expression faltered. And you are? Adrian Mercer, Adrian said calmly, extending a hand he knew Matthew wouldn't take. A friend. Matthew ignored the gesture, his eyes flicking back to Eleanor with desperation. Eleanor, please. I've thought of you every day. We had years together, you can't just erase that. Don't you remember the good times? The laughter, the plans we made? His voice cracked, echoing too loudly in the refined hall. A few guests glanced their way. Eleanor felt a wave of memories, but instead of weakening her, they strengthened her resolve. She remembered the loneliness, the betrayal, the nights she cried herself to sleep while he was with Clara. And then she looked at Adrian, who simply stood by her, offering quiet support without pressing her in any direction. I remember, Eleanor said, her voice firm but calm. I remember giving everything I had to someone who didn't value it. I remember being abandoned on the day that was meant to celebrate my hard work and dedication. I remember pain so deep I thought it would swallow me. But I also remember how I rebuilt myself. I will not go back. Matthew's face crumpled, his bravado collapsing. Please, Eleanor, just one chance. I've lost everything, don't let me lose you too. Eleanor shook her head. You already did. Adrian placed a gentle hand at the small of her back, and together they turned away, leaving Matthew standing alone in the middle of the glittering ballroom. Eleanor didn't look back. For the first time, she felt completely free, not because Matthew was gone, but because she had finally chosen herself. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Adrian glanced at her. You were extraordinary in there. Eleanor exhaled, her breath turning to mist in the lamplight. For years I let his choices define me. Tonight, I defined myself. Adrian smiled, his eyes warm. And that is what makes you remarkable. Eleanor took his arm, and together they walked into the London night, leaving the past behind like a shadow swallowed by the dark. The days after the gala were calmer than Eleanor expected. She thought Matthew's sudden reappearance would rattle her deeply, but instead, she found herself more grounded than ever. Adrian's unwavering presence had shown her that she was no longer the woman who once clung to Matthew's hollow promises. Still, there was an unease lingering in her chest, a quiet sense that Matthew would not let things end so neatly. She was right. One rainy afternoon, as Eleanor left her office, she saw him waiting by her car. His suit was damp from the drizzle, his eyes red as if he hadn't slept. She stiffened but refused to show fear. Matthew, she said flatly, adjusting her umbrella. This isn't appropriate. He stepped forward, desperation etched into every line of his face. Eleanor, please hear me out. I've lost everything. Clara took what little money I had and left me. The business deals I gambled on fell apart. I've hit rock bottom. You were the only thing real in my life, and I threw it away. I see that now. Eleanor inhaled slowly. Rain tapped against her umbrella like a warning drumbeat. You didn't just throw me away, Matthew. You destroyed me when you abandoned me. And you didn't come here because you love me. You came because you're alone. Her words struck him, but instead of retreating, he reached for her hand. She pulled back instantly. Please, he whispered, his voice cracking. Give me another chance. I'll change, I'll prove it. I'll spend every day making it right. Before Eleanor could respond, a familiar voice cut through the rain. Is this man bothering you? Adrian had arrived, his presence calm but resolute. He carried no anger in his expression, only steady protection. Matthew's face twisted with envy as his eyes flicked between them. Of course, Matthew sneered. The knight in shining armor. Tell me, Adrian, do you even know her the way I do? Do you know her quirks, the little things she hides when she's nervous? I do. She's mine, not yours. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice sharp. Stop it, Matthew. I am not yours. Not anymore. I won't let you twist the past into a chain to bind me again. Matthew's expression crumbled, shifting from anger to pleading in a heartbeat. Eleanor, I don't have anyone else. Don't you see? I need you. And I don't need you, she said firmly. The words hung in the rain-soaked air like a final verdict. Adrian took her hand, not as a claim, but as a reassurance. Eleanor owes you nothing, he said evenly. Respect her wishes, and leave. For a moment, Matthew stood frozen, raindrops streaming down his face like unacknowledged tears. Then, without another word, he turned and stumbled away into the grey London street, swallowed by the blur of umbrellas and traffic. Eleanor's knees trembled, but she refused to collapse. Adrian squeezed her hand gently. You were incredible just now. She shook her head. Part of me still feels sorry for him. But pity isn't love. And it doesn't erase the pain. Adrian brushed a damp strand of hair from her face. That's because you have a kind heart. But kindness doesn't mean letting someone hurt you again. You've learned that. That's strength. As they drove away together, Eleanor stared out at the rain-slicked city lights. Matthew had tried one last time to reclaim what he had lost, but she realized now that the chains of her past had finally broken. She wasn't defined by betrayal anymore. She was defined by the choices she made today, and today, she chose freedom, self-respect, and the possibility of love untainted by lies. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt at peace. But in the quiet of her heart, she wondered if Matthew was truly gone, or if the shadow of his desperation would return once more. Weeks passed, and Eleanor's life began to settle into a rhythm she had never thought possible. The storm of Matthew's reappearance had left her cautious, but as each day went by without incident, she realized she was finally stepping into a chapter that belonged only to her. Adrian had become a constant presence, not overwhelming, not demanding, but steady. He respected her boundaries, encouraged her ambitions, and treated her with a level of sincerity she had once believed impossible. Their evenings together were not filled with grand gestures but with warmth, sharing dinner, talking about books, laughing over inside jokes that belonged to no one else but them. One crisp morning, Eleanor stood on the balcony of her flat, the autumn sun spilling golden light over the city. She wrapped her arms around herself, reflecting on how far she had come. The woman who had once been left shattered on her graduation day was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had rebuilt from ashes without losing her compassion. Adrian joined her, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He handed one to her, his smile quiet and genuine. You look thoughtful, he said. I was just remembering, she admitted. It feels like a lifetime ago. I used to think I'd never escape that pain. But now, she trailed off, inhaling the crisp air. Now I feel free. Adrian studied her, his gaze gentle. You've done something remarkable, Eleanor. You didn't just survive, you grew. And you've inspired me more than you know. She met his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't flinch at the thought of vulnerability. I couldn't have done it without people who believed in me. Without you. He shook his head. You had the strength all along. I just reminded you it was there. Silence settled between them, comfortable and unforced. The city stretched out below, alive with movement, but up here on the balcony, time seemed to pause. Later that week, Eleanor attended a university event where she was invited to speak to young graduates about resilience and growth. Standing on stage, facing a room full of hopeful faces, she felt a surge of emotion. She told them about failure, not in detail, not naming names, but about betrayal, heartbreak, and loss. More importantly, she told them about rediscovery, about the power of standing back up even when life felt impossible. The applause that followed was thunderous, but what touched her most was seeing a young woman in the front row wiping away tears, nodding as if Eleanor had spoken directly to her. In that moment, Eleanor knew her pain had not been wasted, it had been transformed into something that could give others courage. That evening, Adrian met her with flowers, simple wildflowers wrapped in paper. For the woman who turned scars into strength, he said softly. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, but not with sorrow, with joy. She realized that while Matthew had once tried to break her, his betrayal had led her here, to a life she never imagined, to a love that was steady and true. As weeks turned to months, Matthew became little more than a shadow in her memory. She no longer wondered where he was or what he was doing. He had made his choices, and she had made hers. The difference was that her choices were no longer chained to regret. On a clear winter night, Eleanor and Adrian stood together in Hyde Park, the trees wrapped in twinkling lights for the holiday season. She leaned into him, warmth spreading through her despite the chill in the air. For the first time in years, she whispered, "I feel like the future isn't something to fear. It's something to look forward to." Adrian kissed her temple and whispered back, "That's because it's yours, Eleanor. Entirely yours." And as snowflakes began to fall, Eleanor smiled, not because her life was perfect, but because she had finally found the courage to live it on her own terms. The past no longer defined her. The future awaited. And for Eleanor Ashford, it was only the beginning.